Welcome to the Books Applied podcast, presented by WSL Leadership. In this podcast, we talk about an awesome book and how to apply it to your work, sport, or life. I'm your host, Iggy Perillo. Thanks for joining me. Hello, and on this episode of the Books Applied podcast, we'll be talking about the book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity by David Graeber and David Wengrow. I am joined today by my very special guest and friend, Rachel Allen. Rachel, can you tell us a little bit about what you do, who you are, and we'll dive into this awesome book.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I am excited to talk to you literally anytime, but especially about this book because I think we're going to nerd out about it real hard. So my name is Rachel Allen. I run Bolt from the Blue Copywriting. We're a full-service creative agency where we work with small businesses who want to make the world a better place, and we make words make money.
That is awesome. And how you introduced this book to me, but I'm curious how you came across this book or how it entered your world.
Yeah, so I'm in a little informal book club with a friend of mine who we're in a leadership program together. And Julie was like, hey, I heard about this book from these two dudes at LSE. It sounds weird. Do you want to read it? And I was like, yes, sold. And we read it together. And then as soon as you started talking about your podcast and you were like, what's a book that's really made an impact on the way that you think about things or the way that you move through the world? And I was like, that one for sure. That's how it sort of entered my sphere.
That's fantastic. That's a great answer. And usually how we always find it, like someone said it's a good book. So I'm like, is it? Let me read it. Is it someone I value? Someone who has a good opinion? Cool. I'm into it. And I got into this book. This is not a lightweight afternoon read. It's like 600 pages long. It's hard. My hardback version is in the 600s of pages, which is hefty. And there's so much to it. And I found it fascinating. I really could not put it down. I cranked through those 600 pages. So what stood out to you? What, like thinking back from this big tome, what was at least one of the things? I'm sure there were many. There were for me many things that caught your attention or made you sort of stop and think a little bit.
So I think if I had to pull out only two, so you asked for one, I'm going to give you two.
Perfect. But who could pull out just one? This book is amazing.
I know, it's a 700-page book. I think the kind of meta thing that stood out to me was questioning really set in stone assumptions, because the whole concept of this book is it's these two dudes from LSE who were like, hey, what if maybe the way that we've thought about anthropology and human history has been based on some assumptions that might not be true? And so they went back and actually reviewed all of these things that we've studied about society and history and humans and evolution and all these things. And they pulled out the underlying assumptions that have informed sort of the way it is in the field right now. And they were like, well, like somebody just decided that. They just made that up. And we've built this entire field of study on it. And so I think the first thing that really stood out to me about this is like, wow, what assumptions might I be making that like literally somebody just made up? And now the entire world is like, I mean, I guess it's true. And entire just castles of scholarship have been built upon. So I was so fascinated by that. And it has me thinking about that a lot in my own life too, of like, okay, where have I just decided something is true and maybe it's not?
Oh, yeah. So true. When you're saying these are two guys from LSE, can you explain what that means a little bit for the people listening?
Oh, sure. Yeah. They're from the London School of Economics, which people abbreviated LSE. Even on their website, they do. I think they like to feel fancy.
They are
fancy.
Were
my rival school in grad school. So I went to King's College London and LSE was right across the road. And so we always compete. So that's how I know them.
Awesome. That's so great. Great. Yeah. So these are, I believe they're basically an economist and an anthropologist is sort of the background of these two authors. And I found the same thing. I think my first message to you about this podcast and having read this book was I've been lied to my whole life. Like there are so many pieces where I'm like, oh yeah, we just sort of accept that thing. La, la, la. Yeah, that's kind of what I learned in school, I guess, whatever. I was not an economics or anthropology student in my days. But yeah, so many pieces of this. You're like, oh, huh. And they really, I think near the end, actually talk about how this happens when they're talking about Crete and the Society of Ancient Crete. And they're talking about it in the context of, well, we haven't seen any matriarchal rulers in any civilizations in the world. We just don't see that. We don't see that. And that's like sort of the common sort of, I don't know, common vibe is like, well, we never had these like strong women rulers. And they're like, hey, by the way, ancient Crete, these years, like I don't, there's so many dates and times. I'm like, between this year and this year, obviously women were running the show. And every time you look at evidence for this, people write it off as like, well, that's some funny art there. Like, oh, that's a weird exception to why they show women in art in these very strong leadership positions. Like, I mean, that's how we have a lot of the record is from art and things. And so, but if you saw a man in this sort of arrangement within a leadership style position in the art, they'd be like, oh yeah, this is obviously a ruler, a leader, a king, someone of importance. But when they see women in that role, they just kind of brush it off as like weird art they had there, huh? And no one really wants to accept that shows women in leadership roles. So that's like an example of how we like have a paradigm and we just keep shoehorning everything into the paradigm that we have. And and there's all this scholarship and research. And I mean, throughout the book, they keep coming up with example after example after example of, there's some scholars that are really poking in and like, oh, wow, this is super interesting. And this is unique and this is different. But that scholarship doesn't necessarily break out into the wider world of, my public school education. Like that's like has been, I missed my chance for new scholarship on that. But so within this realm of, so that was two things. That was one thing. What was the other thing that stuck out to you?
The other thing I think is probably the main assumption I think they bust in this, which is we have this cultural narrative and historical narrative of like, okay, there were humans, like Neolithic humans, and then there were these air quotes primitive humans, and then we've evolved now, and now we are in an advanced and an evolved society, and it's this linear process where like those, like they weren't even like really humans, they were just kind of evolving, but like we're the for realsies people, and so we try to filter all of our scholarship about them through this like, okay, well clearly they couldn't be like us. And what Wengrow and Graeber found where they're like, hey, guess what? Humans are humans, even Neolithic humans. And so all of these things where people try to come up with these very convoluted explanations for like, well, why would they do these massive trade routes in between islands? Why are we finding beads from one island thousands of miles away on another one? Well, maybe it was a vision quest and maybe it was something da 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 da. And they're like, hey, or maybe they just wanted to see what was out there.
Right.
Always be curious. Like we just do random things because that's who we are as a species.
Yeah, or maybe they had some buddies they were visiting. Like I think that's like this beautiful story of sort of how there is ties across the continental United States space, prehistoric or barely historic ties, right? There's records of some things out there, and they show that like you can find artifacts from different regions spread all over the place. And you're like, well, wait, how did shells from the Gulf of Mexico make it to, where we have Washington State now? How did stuff from here make it way over here? And they're like, people like to visit. That's sort of like a possible answer. People like to kind of cruise around, see what was going on. And I think the other myth that they break down is that that life was so difficult that people had no time to just cruise around and visit. Like, in fact, they sort of start off with this kind of earlier setup of, if you were in this kind of quote, air quotey, primitive state of huntery-gatheriness, you actually had a ton of spare time. There was food everywhere. There wasn't the population density that we have now, although there were these giant cities, which I would love to talk about, fascinating. But people had time to, and could sustain their lives and sustain their families and could sustain, their relationships in a way that they could just let out and go visit people and hang out and visit people across, basically the whole region that was the United States on foot at the time and go places and hang out. They're like, were they trade routes? They're like, who cares if they were trade routes? Stuff got there. They made it, whatever. The stuff at some point got from place to place, which, is so fascinating. Like just more lies have been told for sure.
I know. And I don't know, this, like, I love how you were talking about the air quotes primitiveness, because they break that down and they're like, I think we have this idea that we've worked so hard to like get a little toehold on the civilization that we have right now. And like things have never been better. And in some ways, absolutely sure. But also it's not like these societies where, everyone was suffering and life was, to quote Hobbes, which they break down pretty comprehensively, nasty, brutish, and short.
Right.
It was a very different thing. And then sometimes things are nasty, brutish, and short, and sometimes they change. And another thing they talk about a lot, which I really valued, was the circularity of history and how we've lost that. And we see it more as a linear thing now, and they talk about how much anxiety that induces. Because if we are locked into a linear narrative of things have to get better or else they're getting worse and we're going backwards, then of course that's terrifying. But if it's like, hey, sometimes life is hard and sometimes life is good, and then it will be hard again, and then it will be good again. That's such a like I can feel my chest opening up just saying that, you know?
Freeing, very freeing to not be on this constant growth track or this constant progress kind of thing. And I think fundamentally, I know Graeber is known, from what I understand from this and my very, very sketchy research, as a critic of capitalism, let's say, as a very, like, the most benign way to say that, like, of the system. And he, which I love though in the book, though, when they pull out this guy, I don't know how to say this name, is Kadiaronk? Do you know how to say this? Pronounce this name? I don't.
But I know who you're talking about.
Kadiaronk, I guess, is a person of the Wendat people in, so I believe, northeastern U.S., like in the Canada, Nova Scotia sort of range. And I would love to find the years this was happening. Early 1700s, 1703, I think, is a date I just caught on this. And so there's tons of missionaries pouring over to the U.S. If you go to these places, northeastern U.S., southeastern Canada, like, there are missions, there are habitations from Europeans that go pretty far back. And so the story we've been told is like, yeah, the missionaries showed up, kind of decimated everyone, whoopsie, and then, like, here we are. But the reality is there's this huge amount of time where the missionaries are learning from the local inhabitants, the native population. They learn their language, there's communication back and forth. And these people, the Wendat, are known for their oratory skills. They're known to be great speakers, right? And so already many of us who did not have a very nuanced, like, learning background are like, oh yeah, why not? Why wouldn't this population be known for their speaking abilities? Like, cool, that's new to me. But then he goes on to say, not only were they known for these speaking abilities and be able to make really intelligent arguments and really intelligent speeches, they were really critical of the European systems that they brought over. When the Europeans show up, and there are people who are obviously in, I don't know how to describe it, like the serfs or the workers, like, there's a very distinct class society that the Europeans bring over with them. Like, you are either upper class, maybe this tiny little middle class, or like the peon worker, indentured servant to slaves, kind of category of humans. And Kadiaronk is like, this looks stupid. Like, why would you let people be so oppressed within your system? That seems really bad. And the Europeans are like, they don't really have a great response, which is the funnier part at the time. There's like, shut up, you don't know what you're talking about. They just kind of are like, fine, I'm going to take my crucifix and go home. But they don't, they stay around, whatever. But it's this beautiful, like, point of critique of European society, which was, I think, the precursor of what, became dominant in the U.S. system. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just that whole story of how, like, there were a lot of people getting information from the Americas at the time. And people of the Americas were like, what are you doing? Why do you operate like that? That is so stupid. Like, just like really harsh critique of European systems, European culture, European, like, basically hierarchies. Because they had hierarchy, they had systems, they had other, ways of holding their culture that were norms. But and also people could grow and change. And also people had amazing amounts of freedom. And also they had a say in different things. No one was in those spaces was in this sort of underling caste that could never, hope to grow out of it or gain or get ahead. So I love the critique of the Europeans coming in, like, pretty harshly and pretty directly, both.
Well, and what I especially love about that is he critiqued them in his own format that he was used to. And then when he was like, oh, these people are so not listening, he did it in the European format where he was like, oh, okay, the way that you people like to argue is you like to write these really boring, like, nitty-picky books. And so he wrote this long treatise that was sent back and people read it and they were like, okay, it's clearly written by a white dude because nobody who's not a white dude could have written this. And they've just written it off since then. They're like, no, but like, what if it was actually the guy who actually, signed his name to it? What if it was him?
Yeah. What if he actually did this? And he wasn't alone. He's like known, I think, because we have his artifacts and things from him that, yeah, we're out there. And you're like, and this is like, I think the very beginning part of the book is like, like blows up your brain around, yeah, Europe is amazing. European systems were amazing. Go Europe, essentially. And you're like, not everyone thought so. And not only did not everyone think so in terms of like, oh wait, they're stealing our land, right? I think this is a classic sort of American frame on this is, oh yeah, the Europeans showed up, stole a bunch of land, that sucked. Like that was not cool at all. But in reality, the Europeans showed up. There's this long time of like kind of the get to know you time where already the local population was like, you're not cool. How you operate is dumb. Like, what are you thinking?
When I was reading it, so I think I have in my marginalia somewhere, like my translation of what he was saying, and he's like, "You live like this? Like, really?"
Yeah, yeah. He's like, "What?" Like, he didn't even couldn't comprehend that people would be willing to be in the system. And I think this speaks though to this the theme throughout the book that we accept, right? These sort of systems is like, well, this is just how it is. This is kind of how things happened. In reality, so much more nuance, but also we're wrong. Like we're just flat out not correct on a lot of things and there's a lot of history that we condense and we simplify and, we compact down to be like, well, the Europeans showed up and here we are, a lot happened in that time in between.
Yeah. And I really valued along those lines how they brought in so much of what we would call prehistory. Like it was certainly never taught to me. But they go back to talking about how the agricultural revolution, I was about to say industrial revolution, the agricultural revolution was really just a framing. It's not like I was taught that like, okay, there were hunter-gatherer bands, and then somebody figured out how to plant corn in a row. And then the agricultural revolution happened and Mesopotamia changed and whatever. And they're like, I kind of. But framing like that is just a frame.
Yeah, another lie we've been told. The agricultural revolution, everyone, is a lie. Basically, and they're saying, yes, things evolved as people went, and they describe this system of cultivation that is like receding. I forget there's a fancier name for it, but basically rivers flood in the spring, and as they recede, they leave a lot of really good cropland. So if you just whip some seeds out there, they're probably going to grow pretty well. Like the land has already been prepared for you. You don't have to do a lot of cultivation. You cruise by later, harvest whatever grew there. So there were these sort of semi-cultivation things, and they do grow like plants that are important for like ceremonial plants. I don't remember the details, but they're like, oh yeah, if we really want this plant, they know how to grow it. They can make it happen. They can, cultivate plants. Like this is not like the knowledge of cultivation was missing, but no one really wanted to do it because it was too much work. Yeah. And the sort of agricultural revolution, even in the Middle Eastern spaces, they're like, yeah, I guess it was a revolution. It took 3,000 years, but okay, you call that a revolution, that's fine. Like it was a very slow process. It wasn't, I think when we think of in terms of revolution, and maybe this is current, lives, and we're like, revolution, it's like 5, 10, 15 years, like, well, amazing, 3,000 years is a kind of slow process.
Yeah, and certainly not a linear, like, before and after.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's and through all those changes and evolutions, I think another theme that comes throughout the book is, I think he calls it schismogenesis. There's this word that comes up many times, again, like big words. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And that is basically that a culture sort of gets entrenched and gets created, and then people don't like it, essentially. So like, we're out. They leave that space and they create a neighboring, culture, societal organization that's like almost directly opposite to what that space was. And they talk about this in I'm in the Northwest in the US, and they talk about this along the Northwest coast where there's tons and tons of food. There's fish everywhere, tons and tons of fish, super accessible, kind of gross to clean, takes a lot of work, not super pleasant work, to like gut and clean fish, like apparently. And so they had systems of hierarchy within those cultures where, cool, you're the fish cleaners. Let me know when you're done with that. Peace out. The rest of us are going to go over here and throw a party and redistribute. Like it was constantly redistributing the wealth essentially, or the food and the different things. But there were people who were like not high class citizens. The fish cleaning, they describe them as slaves. And I'm like, okay, interesting. But a very clear dynamic between the haves and the have-nots within those cultures. Some people are like, this sucks. They bust out and head south, to basically Northern California range, Southern Oregon range. And suddenly you have all these cultures where there is no class distinction at all. Like, we're not doing that here. That was terrible. We're going to create a culture where there is where there's free like social mobility essentially, but also there's like a flat social structure. Like, there's not a hierarchy ruler or a the peon people. We don't actually have that. We don't need to redistribute things. Like, they brought some pieces, but they're like, we are not having that here. So these cultures were created in direct opposition to a place where they were or had been formed in the first place. I know there's a couple more examples of that throughout the book, which I thought was fascinating. This idea of like rebellion and like just creating something better on the other side.
Yeah, no, I thought that was so interesting too. And how human, right? To be like, I don't even know, like, I don't know what I want, but I definitely don't want that. Like, that is such an us thing to do. And I love I don't know, almost the swing. I saw a lot of parallels in this book as well. So they would talk about how even these cultures where they had very flat societies, there might be maybe like a season of 6 weeks out of the year where they went into a strict hierarchy because they had a need for that. And then once that time was over, it was like, hey, we don't need the society to have such a strict hierarchy with these life or death rules. So we don't. And it was much more based on pragmatism as opposed to this sort of like moral philosophy of, well, yeah, we got to have the hierarchy or else people are going to be lazy. Like, come on.
Ugh, lazy people. And the other part that I think that speaks to is this fascinating part of ancient cities in the U.S. Like cities of like 15,000 people or more along the Mississippi River Valley and sort of southern eastern Ohio Valley areas. Huge cities, not just like a settlement of like a village, but like 15,000 people in a land without, I think, infrastructure of today. Is a pretty big city to maintain. And yet those cities didn't have an official ruler or an official, president or an official chief or an official whatever, except for when they needed one. And I think some of the cities, they describe this place called Poverty Point, which is not the name originally, I'm sure, in northern Louisiana.
I've driven by that like so many times. I know exactly where that is on I-20. Every time I drive by, I'm like, Poverty Point, so cool.
Oh, I've never been. Now I'm like, I need to go there because it was this huge, enormous city, and the people went there and there were structures that were built. Like, I don't know if there were mound structures. I think the mound builders were pretty popular, and pyramidal structures, and like a giant like city infrastructure was built without a hierarchy. And to our minds today are like, how would they do it? How could that happen? But the reality is there was like a time of year that's like, hey, this is the gathering at the space time, and we're going to all gather at this place and do our thing, and we're going to build the infrastructure. Cool, that's done. See you next time, people. See you. Like, they assume one theory is that there were these like ceremonial times where they'd come together and actually do physical labor on the city, and then peace out and cruise around and do other things. Probably visit people. Probably take those shells up to the northwest, whatever it was, in the rest of the time.
Yeah, I know. It's such a different mindset of how to accomplish big things, right? And I think, I don't know, I see so much in our space today where we're fighting basically between these two competing ideologies of, okay, well, we have to have a hierarchy or else nothing gets done. Oh, but hierarchies have the potential to harm, so we can't have a hierarchy at all. Oh. And I see the swing back and forth between that when it's like, okay, well, maybe something else. Maybe we have capacity where we've built 15,000 person cities and it did not require either one of those things. We were able to do something different. So I think if I had to choose a word to sort of summarize my feeling after reading this book, it's possibility. Just like possibility that we have within the species that we're currently sort of like, how do we fix these intractable problems? And I'm like, they're not welded into the rebar of the universe. We made it. We can unmake it. We can do something else. We did something else for a very, very, very long time. And so that's why I got so excited about it. And I'm like, let's do something else. That sounds incredible.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it is very freeing. And at the same time makes you very aware of all the assumptions, cultural assumptions, just any sort of piece of how we are supposed to operate or how we are supposed to form a society or how we're supposed to do these things. And Candia Roddick would say, we actually care about each other and we support each other. Like, we are really based on supporting and caring for all the members of our community. The people who are doing well, the people who are not doing well, the people who have resources, the people who need resources, we take care of them. Our community is happy, it's healthy. People have the freedom to come, go, change, move, whatever. And in the world today, we're like, yes, we have so many resources, but wait, some people do, some don't, and it's a huge mess to try and figure that out. And wait, did they earn it? Like there's that. I think that piece of care is missing in a lot of ways from how a lot of the current world operates. And this is like the big question of the book that they don't quite. I know they actually had plans for more books after this, but now Graeber has passed away, so I think the more books will not be forthcoming, which is a bummer because I want to know how they answer this. But they're sort of question that they don't quite get their teeth into is how did we get stuck in this hierarchical system, essentially? Like, how did we, they sort of have some clues to it here and there. Like, well, why did this even happen that we agreed that this was going to be okay, that this was going to be fine? This is a good idea. Like, how did we sort of fall into that? I mean, essentially trap, what I think Graeber would call it and Wengrow would call it. And yeah, I'm curious how you see the possibilities of that, the possibilities of alternate systems being present in the world today.
Oh gosh. Yeah. So, I mean, I think I love that you brought that out because I was like, but what's the answer? How did we get here? And I'm still thinking about that. There's another book, maybe we'll do another one of these called Street Life that was recently recommended to me, which actually talks about how the importance of place within shaping our thought. So I'm sort of trying to overlay those and be like, okay, well, was it because, what confluence of events? Was it geography? Was it time? Was there something with the weather? Was it something with our nutrition? Was there something to where we sort of mass decided like, I don't know, I guess hierarchy sounds legit, So I don't know the answer, but I think that one thing we can take away from this as far as moving on to other things is simply being aware that it's not set in stone. Anytime I've heard somebody talk about like, oh, that's just human nature, after reading this book, I'm like, friend, I have a book for you to read. Because so much of what we have collectively agreed to today, I think, is built on this very narrow understanding of like, well, that's just how humans are, and that's human nature. And everything is so big, and the problems we're facing are so intractable. And I'm like, things change so fast. What we are living through right now in history is an anomaly. This is one tiny little blip in our species' existence. And where I get up on my soapbox about it is, people get very defeatist, I think, or very overwhelmed, and understandably so, because on an individual human level, we're not used to dealing with this amount of input. But the level of complexity that we're able to operate in, we're the only species that we know of so far, who can operate outside the sandbox. We can create our own world. And I think that that's where the possibility lies, in realizing that what we're living in now is a creation. And if we want something different, then we can make it.
Yep, we sure can. And it's not easy. And yeah. Well, and I guess maybe that's like the next step around applying these ideas. Like, how do we go about creating that better world? Or what ideas? I mean, I've seen that in parts of the work that I do. I'm curious how you see that in the work that you do, or just even, I mean, like, I want to say like, oh, it's a work, we should get paid for it. But the reality is, like, the work is like nonstop, like mind shift a little bit. So I'm trying to see like how you see that present in your world, in your life right now. Like, so making that happen.
I'm so glad you asked. There's two things that I say all the time, both in my professional work, so as a writer, and then also when I'm working on books of my own or when I'm just talking to anybody all the time. I say words make worlds. And that's true. That's just the way it is. Like we have ideas, and the way that our species works is that we share ideas with each other, and that creates more ideas. And those ideas are shared primarily via words. And so words make worlds. And that's how I tap into this for me. Like, words are my deal. I write stuff, and I want to write the future into being. And then the fundamental principle that underlies all of that for me is something I also say all the time in my work, which is human is the only move left. Like, we've tried so hard to sort of squeeze ourselves in to these ideologies or to these understandings, or, to present this perfect face of like a brand of human to the world. And it's just not working. The level of complexity we're living in right now, from an evolutionary standpoint, if nothing else, is so great that there is no static amount of like, well, I'm going to follow this system and that's going to lead me from A to B. We're like in the A to sardine level of complexity right now. And so I think the only move we have is showing up with the full capacity of our humanity and really being like, okay, as a full human with all the capacities I have and what I am willing to do and what I am willing to take the consequences for and what I am willing to take responsibility for, what am I going to do right now, like in this moment? And that's how I'm sort of stepping my way towards the future.
That's awesome. So it's both hyper personal and like hyper immediate at the same time. Like, what am I, this person who I am right here, right now, doing literally right here, right now? Yeah, I love it. I think uh, that sort of makes it so immediate. Like that is like the most immediate space we can operate in is the self.
Yeah.
And I think there's things to be said for finding like minds or finding support of other people. But the reality is, I talk a lot about how our values are basically the fossil record of our values is our daily habits. And so if we're in daily habits of like, kind of being unhuman, having realistic, unhuman expectations for ourselves or for other people around us, that habit is not supporting a more robust human, deeper human culture with a full possibility. I mean, that's like, cool, I'm going to support one slice of how the world should look or how the world should operate. So I like the idea of, and for me, that means bringing a sense of care into work and working my work with leaders and organizations. We have policies. I mean, you can read a policy and you read it and you're like, oh, this seems like a good idea. But then if you step back and look at it, this is stupid. Like, why, why are we doing it this way? And there's something to be said for mission or vision or, like those, not those types of like pieces of an organization, but the policy of how it actually operates. And I see this sort of beautiful sort of change in the work world, which is where I spend some of my time thinking around people who are like, you know what, I don't want to work for a jerk. I don't want to have terrible, work environment. I'm just not going to work there. And so you'll hear people saying, it's hard to get people to work here. I'm like, the problem is the here, not the people, like whatever it is going on. I think people are more willing to reject the inhumane and like unhuman, I guess, is like not inhumane. That like makes it sound like they're like, aggressively attacking people, but the soul crushing nature of work where your opportunity is to like build your capacity for silent suffering is not as popular anymore. And I think those spaces of where people are like at least rejecting sort of the status quo, I think are beautiful. I love it.
Absolutely. And I think that ties bang into what has to be the other part of this equation, which is like, what are your greater commitments, Because like if your greater commitment is to become the fullest version of yourself or to care for your family or for whatever, then sitting there doing something that makes you miserable every single day for no gain other than some monetary reimbursement, it's just not worth it. And so I think, like you're saying, so many more people are becoming aware of that and unwilling to make that trade. Let me see if I can remember. There's a William Burroughs quote that always comes to my mind, and let me see if I can get it. But he says, there are no honorable exchanges of quantitative goods like money for qualitative goods like souls.
Mm-hmm.
We're really coming to that truth.
Yeah. It's never worth it to buy a soul. It's never worth it to sell your soul, basically, is what he's saying. Like it's never going to be worth it in the end. Yeah. And yet we have a long history, and there's this beautiful part where like, well, that's just how it is. Like maybe that's how it is now. Or when people say that's how it's always been, now I'm like, absolutely not. That's not how it's always been, whatever. But yeah. The acceptance of that, I think I love it when there's like sort of some chinks in that sort of monolith of this is how we do things. This is how it is. This is the culture we live in, and culture isn't changeable. Like culture is changeable. Culture evolves. Culture can be shifted. And there's a lot of inertia to culture. Like not to say like, yeah, we'll just flip a switch and we're going to be all caring for each other, giving each other freedom, supporting everyone within these beautiful, community spaces. It's going to be, it's not easy to do. I think, there are so many possibilities that they mentioned throughout this whole book. And it basically example after example after example where people were doing it better, and these people were doing it better, and these people were doing it better, and these people over here, like basically all around the world, examples of how folks had done it better, as like done better being like a society, a system of living, or an organization that supports the community, builds beautiful like aqueducts to get water places, yet has no hierarchy. All these sort of different examples of we can have public goods without hierarchy, and that's where our brains sort of disconnect. The book that I'm reading based on this book is Capitalist Realism by I think it's Mark Fisher, and it's a short little book. I mean, this is like an 80-pager, which is very dense though about how we assume capitalism is the way things have to be. Like that's sort of his sort of take on it. Just like, yeah, we're like, capitalism is great. We can't, and he would say, we can't even imagine a different system right now because it's so pervasive in our
Yeah.
lives and how we operate. And I think it is pervasive in some cultures and some systems. In my experience as a American citizen, like, yeah, capitalism so pervasive. And but yet there's like little fringes around here. There's like cooperatives, there's collectives, there's these sort of anti-capitalist movements and I would say anti-capitalist leaders who still operate in the world of commerce because it is so pervasive, right? There's a great friend of mine talked about the difference between capitalism and commerce. Like you have to engage in commerce, but you actually don't have to engage in capitalism. Like this sort of list of oppressive tactics to always be on that growth trajectory is not necessary. Yeah. And you can be growing, you can be changing, you can be evolving, you can make money. You don't have to be an oppressive jerk about it, essentially, along the way.
Yeah, and I love that you brought that up because one of my favorite little etymological soapboxes to jump on is commerce. If you go all the way back in the roots and everything, it actually comes from words about connection. And
so, tell me more about that. Tell me more about that.
That's my I don't know. I got really interested in this because of all things. I used to live in DC, and so I would go to the Library of Congress to work because, of course. And they have this giant reading room where you can go and sit and work. And up around the edges of this dome, they have all of these statue depictions of like the great ideas through history. So there's medicine and art and history, and then there's commerce. And I was like, yeah, like say what? Mm-hmm. And so then I got really interested and I started looking into it. And if we go back etymologically, the entire basis of commerce initially was connection. Like we connect, we trade, two sides trade. I'm making hand gestures like you and me. And that's a completely different understanding than extractive capitalism.
Oh, right.
So that's something that I do a lot in my own business. I talk about how business as it is set up now, online internet entrepreneurship, it's an access point to power, and the barrier to entry is so much lower than it has ever been. And I really want us to go back. I'm trying to stack the deck so that we move towards commerce and away from extraction.
I love it. I love that deeper part. I thought my friend was smart, but this is a so much smarter way to look at it, right? What is the statue do you remember what the statue depiction of commerce looked like? I
have a picture. I'll send it through.
Okay. Great. Everyone else, just go Google it because it'll be interesting. I'm sure it looks different than someone pushing other people down so they can get up. Like I suspect that is not what the picture is, right? But when we think of capitalism, that is sort of what the sort of the worst case stereotype is. What can I extract? Who can I get to do it as cheaply as possible? How can I get the most, benefit personally from that, exchange versus, how can we just have a good time out here? Which is like really going all the way back to Candirondack again. Like, why would we work that hard? Like there's a couple of different times where he's like, that's cool, I guess, if you want to live like that, but like, why? It doesn't make you happy. That doesn't look fun. And essentially he's like, that doesn't look fun. Why would I do it? Like another way, like that's a beautiful critique of like, does this make any sense? And meanwhile, the Europeans are like, obviously, yes, we don't know why. Throwing, great way to go, capitalists and class, importing class and all these different things that are not great. Not great. This has been fabulous conversation. This is like the worst question ever, but I'm going to ask anyway. What do you think people should take away from this book if they should go read it, I think, first, because they'll blow their minds. There's so much great, like actual historical, actual anthropological records that will like make you realize how many lies you've been told in every history class you ever went to through, high school and college, probably, perhaps. If they're going to read this book, where do you think people should focus, or what are like the biggest takeaways that you hope people get from this book to move forward into their lives?
I think the biggest takeaway is simply the capacity to question that which seems inevitable. Anything that seems, what do they call it? They talk about historical determinism, right? Things happen. We have this concept that things happen the way they happen because they had to have happened that way. It's history. But really, anything can change at literally any moment. And so I think just building that capacity to be like, is that true? Do I want this? Do I maybe want something different? And what am I going to do about it? And being able to move through the world in that kind of space, I think that's revolutionary.
That is great. That is so good. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Rachel, for bringing your thoughts and ideas and bringing this book to my attention and bringing your thoughts and ideas to the podcast today. It's been great chatting with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for letting me nerd out with you about it. It was awesome.
Nerd times are the best times. All right. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Books Applied podcast. I hope you enjoyed getting to know a new book and learning how to apply its ideas to make your work, sport, or life a little bit more awesome. For more leadership education related content, including conflict management checklists, invitations to a fun free lunch that happens monthly, upcoming classes, webinars, and mastermind groups, please head over to wslleadership.com. Thanks, and have a great day.